one of the things that I find somewhat disturbing is how Reza tries to hedge his bets. And so this is kind of not exactly where we're going today, because we want to get to a discussion of the deity of Christ. But Reza has some interesting thoughts about the historical method. Now we've had several shows on him already, and he has a real problem picking and choosing. At other times, he'll just grant something that I would never expect him to grant. But he does seem to guard against anyone disagreeing with him by quoting passages that he's not using, by saying this: "There are a few things to keep in mind before we begin our examination. For every well-attested, heavily researched, and eminently authoritative argument made about the historical Jesus, there is an equally well-attested, equally researched, and equally authoritative argument opposing it." Now, I'm going to read that again just so that sinks in with what everyone says, for everyone here. This is a book where he's saying he's got the correct view of Jesus. He has sifted through the historical documents and the scholarly writings, and he has gotten to the bottom of the life of Jesus so he can explain for everyone what the true Jesus was like. And pay attention once again to what he just said. There are a few things to keep in mind before we begin our examination. For every well-attested, heavily researched, and eminently authoritative argument made about the historical Jesus, there is an equally well-attested, equally researched, and equally authoritative argument opposing it. No matter what you say, no matter what argument you have about the historical Jesus, there is another argument saying the opposite that's equally well-researched and equally authoritative. Mike, would you regard that as as accurate in the field of historical Jesus studies?
Well, no, I wouldn't. And first of all, when I hear you quoting him on that, I'm thinking, all right, well, why should we believe then his view of Jesus above others? Yep. Why should we believe that his is correct? He would have no claim to it being correct. But I would say if you do research in the field of historical Jesus studies, you won't find equal views. Now, you're not going to find any kind of agreement, but you don't find that in a lot of history that is non-religious in nature, and that's why pluralism is a basic characteristic of history as a discipline. There's very little on which historians agree in terms of things such as method and approaches to history. And there are a lot of things that they disagree on when it comes to historical research. And that's going to happen when it comes to theology and religious studies as well. A lot of that has to do with worldview. People are guided by their worldview more than they are by sound historical method. But when you look at, you study the field of historical Jesus research like I do, you find that a lot of times people are just simply guided by their worldviews. So for example, you've got Gerrit Ludemann. He's an atheist New Testament scholar. And in his book, The Resurrection of Christ, he says, we can just know certain things. For example, we know that Jesus didn't ascend into heaven because there's no heaven for Jesus to ascend into. Or James Tabor, in his book, The Jesus Dynasty, he said, listen, we know the virgin birth did not occur because we know that any time that a woman gives birth to a baby, there was always a man involved. So, of course, both of those are just simply worldview statements. They have nothing to do whatsoever with historical investigation. So, yeah, I do think when I studied the resurrection of Jesus quite extensively, as you know, and there just simply is no other competing hypothesis that can hold a candle to the resurrection hypothesis. It is by far the best historical explanation of the known historical data. You can reject it on theological or philosophical grounds, but you can't do so rationally on historical grounds.
Interesting. And what you were saying about biases affecting our interpretations, this is interesting because Reza says here in his introduction, scholars tend to see the Jesus they want to see. Too often they see themselves, their own reflection in the image of Jesus they have constructed. And this is interesting because earlier we were having a program on his overall presentation of Jesus as this sort of jihadist Jesus, this Jesus who's bent on violent revolution and fails and is crucified for it. This seems to be a Jesus that's being made more violent to make it better by comparison with Islam. What we have in Islam, you have Muhammad, and Muhammad violently subjugating unbelievers, and Jesus looks very peaceful and loving by comparison. And so the job of many Muslim apologists in the West is to make Jesus sound more violent and Muhammad sound more peaceful, which is exactly what Reza Aslan does. But then we open it up, and in his book, he's talking about scholars seeing the Jesus they want to see. And the Jesus he wants to see is a radical, violent Jesus. Now, what's interesting is, as you pointed out, it's very odd to say that for any, serious argument you can make about Jesus, there's an equally serious argument to be made against it, both of them equally well-researched, because over and over again he claims that he has the correct position about Jesus. Let me read a passage here at the end of his introduction. He says, "If we expose the claims of the Gospels to the heat of historical analysis, we can purge the Scriptures of their literary and theological flourishes and forge a far more accurate picture of the Jesus of history." Well, how are we forging an accurate picture when no matter what you say about Jesus, there's an equally good argument against it? He says, "Indeed, if we commit to placing Jesus firmly within the social, religious, and political context of the era in which he lived, an era marked by the slow burn of a revolt against Rome that would forever transform the faith and practice of Judaism, then in some ways his biography writes itself." So his biography is pretty straightforward. He says, "The Jesus that is uncovered in the process may not be the Jesus we expect. He certainly will not be the Jesus that most modern Christians would recognize. But in the end, he is the only Jesus that we can access by historical means." This is the only Jesus we can access by historical means. But if you doubt me, keep in mind that any argument you make, there's an equally strong argument against it. And that's what I mean by sort of hedging his bets here. It's I have the correct view of Jesus. You're all wrong if you disagree with me. But if you dare make an argument, keep in mind we can't really know anything because the evidence is always going to be equally balanced here. And that's all at the very beginning of his book. That's sort of so anyway. That's disturbing.
Contradicts himself, doesn't he?
Yeah.
What's interesting is if James D.G. Dunn is correct in his book Jesus Remembered, then historians cannot do the very thing that Reza is suggesting that he can do, because you can't peel the Jesus of history away from this Christ of faith, as he wants to suggest, because that's what we have in the Gospels. We don't have a different Jesus in the Gospels, and as Dunn argues, what we have is Jesus as he is remembered. So it's hard to peel that away as he's remembered and get to a Jesus as he wasn't remembered and claim that that's the real Jesus.